One of the defining traits of the post-World War II era is mass urbanization. This urbanization process occurred in diverse ways at distinct rates in various eras. In large part, the differentiator is time. Not everything in the Industrial Revolution happened at once. The generally accepted first step of the Industrial Revolution occurred in the sleepy world of textiles. Pre-industrial textile work was typically a cottage industry. A variety of different plant and animal inputs required a variety of different processing methods. Once the raw material had been somewhat processed, it could be spun or thrown into yarn or thread, and eventually either woven into cloth with a loom or knitted and crocheted. It was all kind of tedious, and few ever really enjoyed it, except perhaps contemporary hipsters who only enjoy it ironically. That hardly means there wasn't money to be made, with the British the first to become interested at scale. It began by using ultra-cheap Indian labor to do all the tedious, annoying work. The East India Company, founded in 1600 to bring in spices to make English food less soul-crushing, transitioned by the century's end to more heavily focus on distributing Indian cloth throughout the empire. Imperial citizens all became aware of the accessible glory of cotton, muslin, calico, even silk. Having tasted the profits of someone else's labor, and having discovered that pretty much everything out of India was better than the wool that was used in Britain's homegrown textile industry, the race began to do everything better. As the 1700s rolled on, the British began importing cotton, at first from the Indian subcontinent, and later the American colonies turned to United States, and started building a large-scale cottage-cum-guild industry for textiles. As the years ticked by and workers and bosses developed newfangled ways of increasing productivity, complexity, and durability. One by one, the new inventions increased what was possible in terms of speed, volume, and value. By 1800, all these inventions and more were widespread throughout Britain. Inventions built upon inventions to the point that in the early 1800s, cotton goods accounted for 40% of the value of British exports. Nor were they the end of the story. At the same time the British were experimenting with a million variations of how to spin, weave, and sew, they were making the transition from charcoal to coke to coal, from pig iron to wrought iron to cast iron to steel, from water wheels to steam engines. Handmade tools gave way to lathes and milling machines that could make the instruments that enabled the fabrication of chemicals. Bit by bit, people found employment in the development and operationalization and refinement of these new techniques. Nearly all the new technologies required mass co-location at specific work sites with installed equipment. The old cottage textile system was farm or ranch-based and wind, or more likely human, powered. The new industrial conditions were urban-based and coal-driven. The countryside drained as people chased the money. Towns became cities. The new concentrations of peoples generated their own challenges, necessitating demand for and innovations in the fields of medicine, sanitation, transport, and logistics. And each of these hundreds of technological improvements altered the relationship of humans to economics and resources and place. Governments started facilitating or providing mass services, everything from electricity to healthcare, and those services are easier to provide in dense urban footprints than across the scattered countryside. People moved en masse off the farms to the cities, seeking what they perceived as higher standards of living for less of an outlay of personal effort. A second aspect of the Industrial Revolution proved equally adept at changing people versus geography relationships: the development of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides. Once they were introduced in the mid-1800s, it was fairly common to see agricultural output per acre triple or more, while simultaneously reducing labor inputs. The economics of agriculture shifted irrevocably. It was no longer the towns pulling people from the farms, but now the farms were pushing people into the cities. The net effect of the new urban industries and the newly hyper-productive countryside started all of us down the road to city living, spawning a host of issues the human race is still grappling with today. By far the most dramatic impact has been on birth rates. On the farm, having children was more often an economic decision than it was about love. Children were free labor that were de facto chained to their parents' economic needs. There was an understanding, rooted in millennia of cultural and economic norms, that children would either take over the farm as their parents aged, or at least not move all that far away. The extended family formed a tribe that consistently supported one another. This cultural economic dynamic has held true since the dawn of recorded history, even to and through the consolidation of the world into empires and nation-states. Urbanization tossed those norms out the window. Move from a sprawling farm into a quarter-acre plot in a small town, much less a high-rise condo in a dense metropolis, and the economics of children collapse. There is no longer all that much work for the kids to do, yet the kids still need to be clothed and fed. With the farm's output no longer at the parents' fingertips, food must be paid for. Even with summer jobs and paper routes, the best parents can hope for, as regards their mini-me's, is a net zero financial position. Move from the small town to the city, and children quickly devolved in economic terms into being little more than really pricey conversation pieces. And while more than one parent cries tears of sad joy when the kids finally move out, there tends to be little of the panic that would have occurred had such vacating happened on a pre-industrial, near subsistence level farm. When much of the economic rationale for having children evaporates, people do what comes naturally. They have fewer of them. And yet, populations grew throughout the industrialization process. Part of the reason for this is obvious. Vastly improved distribution systems, combined with the development and application of synthetic pesticides and herbicides and especially fertilizers, generated more and more reliable food production, removing the famine cap. Part of this is less so. Sewers disposed of waste, reducing incidence of disease. Town living reduced accidents and improved access to medical care, reducing mortality, especially infant mortality. Better medicines reduced deaths from already less common disease and injury. All expanded lifespans. Double the average lifespan, and in a generation you have doubled the population, independent of people having more kids, because they have more childbearing years to live through. But it isn't like this all happened at once. Take the power loom, which is generally credited as being the most significant of the early breakthroughs, increasing output per worker hour by a factor of 50. The first prototype was built in 1785. But it ultimately went through 5 decades of refinement in 17 distinct phases. Even then, it took nearly another century of tinkering to make the loom fully automatic, so that the whole operation didn't need to be shut down when the shuttle ran out of material. The revolution part of the Industrial Revolution is a bit of a misnomer. The new techs weren't magically developed or applied at once, but instead designed, prototyped, perfected, mass-produced, and mass-applied, and in turn they gave birth to daughter and granddaughter technologies over the course of 200 years. The shift from the farm to the town took time. The growing of London into the world's largest, richest, most educated city took time. The transformation of cultural and economic norms of huge families flush with backup children, where the average adult died in his 30s, to tiny families where kids were considered obnoxiously loud and annoyingly mobile safety hazards, and where 60-year-olds were common, took time. The tripling of the British home population took time. For the British, the entire transformation took 7 generations, but only for the British.